By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a phase in which control of the Philippines became central to the strategies of both the United States and Japan. After advances through New Guinea and the Central Pacific, United States forces under General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippine archipelago with the invasion of Leyte in October 1944. The U.S. Sixth Army landed with roughly 200,000 ground troops, supported by extensive naval and air forces, against an estimated 70,000 Japanese defenders on Leyte. The outcome on Leyte would determine whether the Allies could cut Japan's sea routes from Southeast Asia and gain bases for operations toward Luzon and ultimately the Japanese home islands. For Japanese commanders of the 14th Area Army and associated naval and air forces, the defense of the Philippines was tied to preserving access to oil and raw materials from territories such as the Netherlands, East Indies, and Malaya. Loss of the Central Philippine Islands threatened to sever these connections. After the defeat of the Imperial Japanese Navy at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, organized naval intervention on a large scale became difficult, shifting responsibility for disrupting Allied operations to land-based air units and the remaining ground forces in the archipelago. The geography of the Philippines shaped the next steps. Luzon, with the capital Manila, major ports, and numerous airfields, was the decisive objective. Mindoro, a roughly oval island about 95 miles long and 50 miles wide, lying just south of Luzon and separated from it by the Verde Island Passage, offered an intermediate base within fighter range of northern Luzon. Compared to Leyte, parts of southwest Mindoro experienced a pronounced dry season from December to April, a factor favorable for constructing and operating airfields during the planned winter campaign. Operational experience on Leyte reinforced the importance of such bases. Heavy rains and soft ground there complicated the building of airstrips and restricted the tempo of air operations. U.S. planners concluded that the main landings on Luzon, tentatively scheduled for early January 1945 at Lingayen Gulf, would require closer, more reliable air support than Leyte could provide. Mindoro's position south of Manila Bay and near sea lanes through the central Visayan Islands made it suitable not only for fighter coverage of Luzon, but also for protecting shipping routes feeding the larger operation. On the American side, planning for Mindoro was incorporated into the evolving Musketeer series of plans for the reconquest of the Philippines within the Southwest Pacific area. Mindoro was designated as the next objective of Sixth Army after Leyte, with a separate task force built around elements of the 24th Infantry Division and the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team, supported by 7th Fleet Amphibious and Escort Forces and by 5th and 13th Air Forces. Preliminary estimates envisaged a landing force of around 10,000 to 12,000 ground combat troops, plus supporting engineers and service units to secure southwest Mindoro and build airfields near San Jose. Japanese dispositions on and around Mindoro reflected the strain on their resources by late 1944. The island itself held roughly 1,000 to 1,200 Army personnel, including elements responsible for local defense and an air warning station in the north, far fewer than on larger islands such as Luzon or Leyte. Air power that could influence Mindoro was concentrated instead on bases in Luzon and other central Philippine islands. From these fields, Japanese air units, increasingly resorting to special attack, kamikaze, tactics developed during the Leyte battles, aimed to challenge Allied convoys approaching any new landing area. Local conditions on Mindoro added another dimension. Much of the island is mountainous, with limited coastal plains where roads and settlements clustered. Before the American return, Japanese authority outside these coastal pockets was constrained by terrain, limited manpower, and the activity of Filipino guerrilla organizations that had formed after the 1942 occupation. By late 1944, guerrilla groups controlled significant interior areas and maintained contact with Allied commands, providing intelligence on Japanese positions and local geography that would later inform detailed invasion planning. For civilians on Mindoro and in the wider Philippines, the approach of another major campaign followed years of occupation. Food shortages, forced labor, and internal conflicts between collaboration, accommodation, and resistance. Some communities saw the prospect of Allied landings as a route to the restoration of Commonwealth authority and relief from wartime controls. Others anticipated renewed fighting, bombardment, and reprisals. Their expectations, like those of soldiers and commanders, were shaped by the recent experience of the Leyte operations, and by the visible escalation of air and naval activity in the seas to the south and east of Luzon, as 1944 drew to a close. In early December 1944, the opening moves toward Mindoro began not with ships, but with airfields. Allied planners ordered a concentrated air campaign against Japanese bases on Luzon and in the central Philippines. Fighters and bombers from carrier groups and land bases targeted runways, dispersal areas, and fuel depots, attempting to reduce the number of aircraft that could be launched against any forthcoming amphibious operation. American reports credited these attacks with destroying several hundred aircraft on the ground, though Japanese records suggest lower totals. For air crew and ground personnel on both sides, this period felt like a continuous cycle of strikes, repairs, and redeployments, with the precise objective of the Allies still not publicly announced. Within the Southwest Pacific Area Command, the decision to execute the Mindoro landing translated into specific assignments. General Douglas MacArthur remained the overall theater commander. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 6th Army was responsible for the ground assault. Admiral Thomas Kincaid's 7th Fleet provided naval support. Under this framework, the Western Visayan Task Force was formed, combining elements of the 24th Infantry Division and the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team under Major General Roscoe B. Woodruff and Lieutenant Colonel George M. Jones. At sea, the amphibious group, including numerous landing ships and smaller craft, operated under the 7th Amphibious Force, while escort carriers and surface combatants formed separate fire support and air cover groups. On the Japanese side, the opening phase unfolded as part of a broader attempt to organize the defense of the entire Philippine archipelago. General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 14th Area Army directed ground dispositions, while the 4th Air Army and Naval Air Units were tasked with contesting Allied movements by air. Lieutenant General Rikichi Tsukada, already associated with airborne and special units, held responsibilities connected to central Luzon defenses, and, by extension, to the airfields whose aircraft might be used against any Mindoro convoy. Low numbers of ground troops on Mindoro itself meant that the island could not be treated as a major defensive bastion. Instead, Japanese staff expected to rely on air attacks launched from other islands and on local warning stations to delay or disrupt a landing. For Filipino guerrilla organizations and civilians on Mindoro, the opening phase appeared in different forms. Guerrilla groups monitored coastal waters, tracked Japanese patrols, and reported increased aircraft movements and shipping to Allied liaison officers. In coastal settlements, residents observed changes in Japanese behavior, such as heightened alertness around communication points and efforts to move supplies inland. Rumors circulated that a new landing might come either to Mindoro or to other islands closer to Manila, but there was no public announcement, and population movements remained limited by fear of both renewed fighting and possible Japanese reprisals. The seaborne phase began when the invasion convoy assembled in Leyte Gulf. On December 12, 1944, dozens of transports, cargo vessels, and landing ships carrying roughly 10,000 ground troops put to sea, screened by destroyers, destroyer escorts, cruisers, and supported at a distance by escort carriers and fast carrier groups. For the soldiers on board, many of whom had recently fought on Leyte, the departure represented a short interval between campaigns. For naval crews, it was another long transit through waters where submarines and aircraft had repeatedly struck convoys in previous months. Japanese air commands interpreted the sailing of a large convoy from Leyte as confirmation that another significant landing was imminent. With conventional naval intervention no longer available on the scale of earlier operations, staff officers emphasized the use of special attack aircraft. Pilots assigned to these missions, drawn from both experienced and newly trained personnel, received briefings that stressed the operational necessity of damaging or sinking transports and command ships. Ground crews worked to keep aircraft serviceable under conditions of fuel shortage and prior bombardment damage, while radar and visual warning stations attempted to track the convoy's progress. The first direct clash of this opening phase occurred on December 13th, when Japanese aircraft located and attacked the convoy as it advanced toward Mindoro. A kamikaze struck the light cruiser serving as a flagship, detonating fuel and ordnance and causing 133 fatalities and 190 wounded among the crew. The senior landing force commander on board was injured and had to be evacuated, requiring an adjustment in command arrangements. Other aircraft damaged tank landing ships and smaller vessels. From the American naval perspective, these attacks demonstrated that even heavily escorted convoys face significant risk from determined air units. From the Japanese standpoint, the strike showed that special attack tactics could inflict measurable losses despite Allied air cover and anti-aircraft fire, encouraging further employment of such methods in the days ahead. Strategic planning for the Mindoro operation linked the island explicitly to the projected landings at Lingayen Gulf on Luzon. Within the broader Philippines campaign, Mindoro was designated as a key location where U.S. forces would establish airfields to support major landings scheduled on Luzon in early January 1945. On December 15, 1944, the timetable called for an assault on the southwest coast of Mindoro, followed less than a month later by the 6th Army landing on Luzon's western shore. The intention was to shorten the distance between fighter bases and the Lingayen beaches to within reliable single-engine range, overcoming the limitations experienced on Leyte. American planners assessed Mindoro's San Jose area as suitable for rapid airfield construction despite the island's generally rugged interior. The coastal plain around Mangarin Bay offered space for at least 2 major airstrips and dispersal areas. Engineering units were assigned to begin grading and laying runways as soon as a beachhead was secure, with the expectation that fighter and medium bomber groups could operate from Mindoro in time to support the Luzon landings. The logistical plan therefore prioritized landing not only infantry and artillery, but also aviation engineers, construction equipment, fuel, and ammunition in the first waves. Command arrangements reflected these priorities. General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area headquarters set the objectives. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 6th Army received the mission to seize Mindoro. Admiral Thomas Kincaid's 7th Fleet was tasked with transporting and covering the landing force. Within this framework, Kruger assigned the operation to Major General Roscoe Woodruff's 24th Infantry Division, with the 19th Infantry Regiment and the separate 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team under Lieutenant Colonel George M. Jones designated as the main assault elements. The force was deliberately sized to be large enough to secure the southern sector and protect the airfields, but light enough not to divert major formations needed for Luzon. Air and naval planning were closely integrated. The Mindoro attack force would be shielded by escort carriers and surface escorts, while fast carrier groups of the U.S. 3rd Fleet were scheduled to strike Japanese airfields on Luzon during the critical days of the approach. 5th and 13th Air Forces were tasked to continue the pre-invasion air campaign that had already targeted runways and aircraft concentrations in central Philippines. This planning took into account the increasing use of kamikaze tactics since the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and anti-aircraft dispositions on transports and support ships were adjusted to create overlapping fields of fire against low-altitude attackers. Japanese strategic planning started from the different assumptions. Staff officers of the 14th Area, Army, and associated naval commands evaluated the terrain of Mindoro as unfavorable for large air-base construction, and noted that, apart from a small airfield at San Jose, the island seemed to offer few facilities attractive to an invader. Expecting that the next major Allied move would strike Panay, Cebu, or Negros in the western Visayas, they concentrated plans for large-scale air attacks in those sectors. When intelligence indicated Allied convoys leaving Leyte, Japanese air units scheduled renewed operations, but time was lost searching for targets off other islands while the Mindoro task force advanced. Within this framework, the Japanese High Command did not allocate major ground forces to Mindoro. The island's garrison, roughly on the order of 1,000 to 1,200 personnel, was expected to delay rather than repel an invasion, while the decisive blows were to be delivered from the air by units based on Luzon and other central islands. Fuel shortages, prior bombardment, and limited numbers of serviceable aircraft constrained these plans. To compensate, air leaders increasingly relied on special attack missions against Allied shipping, hoping that the destruction of transports and key warships would slow the overall timetable of the Philippines campaign, even if Mindoro itself could not be held. Filipino guerrilla networks were also incorporated into planning, though in different ways by each side. U.S. staff made use of reports from guerrilla commanders on Mindoro concerning Japanese troop locations, coastal defenses, and suitable landing beaches, integrating this information into reconnaissance and hydrographic surveys. Japanese security forces, aware of these contacts, attempted to limit guerrilla activity through patrols and reprisals, but their limited manpower and the island's interior terrain reduced the effectiveness of such measures. As the date of the landing approached, the strategic goals of both sides thus converged on a relatively narrow coastal sector, with one coalition seeking to establish a forward air base for the assault on Luzon, and the other attempting, with constrained resources, to inflict enough damage to alter that operational design. Before dawn on the 15th of December, 1944, the Allied task force approached the southwest coast of Mindoro in darkness and rain squalls. Navigation teams on the leading ships used radar, soundings, and pre-invasion reconnaissance charts to align the transports and landing craft with the designated approach lanes off Mangarin Bay. Offshore, destroyers and cruisers took up fire support stations, while escort carriers repositioned to launch early combat air patrols. For most soldiers on board, conditions consisted of cramped troop compartments, equipment checks, and briefings repeated in low light as units prepared to move into the landing craft. The first combat actions of the day were carried out by naval and air elements. Shortly after sunrise, supporting warships opened fire on identified coastal positions, suspected gun emplacements, and radio facilities near San Jose. Bombardment plans were based on aerial photographs and guerrilla reports indicating limited fixed defenses rather than continuous fortifications. Overhead, carrier aircraft and land-based fighters flew protective patrols, scanning for any sign of Japanese aircraft coming from Luzon or Central Philippine airfields. The absence of immediate large air formations suggested that earlier raids on Japanese bases had at least disrupted coordinated sorties. As the naval bombardment continued, waves of landing craft began moving toward the shore. Amphibious tractors and landing craft carried infantry, engineers, and specialized teams tasked with marking beaches, clearing obstacles, and establishing communications. For officers in the assault battalions, the priorities were to secure a narrow strip of coast, wide enough for follow-on waves, and to reach pre-selected points from which to push inland toward the planned airfield sites. For the engineers, the first hours would determine how quickly heavy equipment could be brought ashore, once the beaches were declared operational. Japanese forces on Mindoro reacted with the resources available at local level. Coastal observation posts reported the approach of the convoy and the opening of the bombardment. Communications with higher headquarters on Luzon were maintained as long as lines remained intact, but the scale of the landing made it clear that only limited opposition could be mounted from within the island. Some machine gun and mortar positions engaged the first landing waves, and small groups attempted to delay the advance along roads and tracks leading inland. Given the disparity in firepower and the effect of naval guns and airstrikes, these actions were more in the nature of local resistance than a coordinated attempt to repel the landing. Filipino guerrilla units, operating in the interior and around villages near the coast, moved quickly to exploit the situation. Prior contacts with Allied liaison officers enabled them to guide some assault elements away from flooded ground and toward firm routes into the interior. In several areas, guerrilla groups secured bridges, river crossings, and road junctions ahead of regular troops, reducing the need for combat in those locations. Civilians in coastal settlements experienced the landing primarily through the noise of bombardment, aircraft overhead, and the sudden arrival of foreign troops in large numbers. Some communities sought immediate contact with the newcomers, while others remained in place until the extent of fighting became clearer. Air activity increased as the day progressed. Allied fighters flew low-altitude patrols along the approaches to Mindoro and over the landing area, ready to intercept any Japanese aircraft that appeared. Japanese air units attempted to reach the region with individual or small groups of aircraft, including special attack planes directed against shipping. Some of these aircraft were engaged by combat air patrols before reaching the beaches. Others penetrated the defensive pattern and attacked isolated vessels. Damage reports from both sides noted losses and hits, but the overall pattern remained one of sporadic strikes rather than a concentrated air offensive at this stage. On the ground, the first hours after landing were devoted to consolidating a perimeter. Infantry units moved to a line that would shield the projected airfield sites from direct attack, while artillery batteries established firing positions to support further advances. Engineers surveyed the flat coastal areas, marking out runway axes, dispersal zones, and access roads. The rapid establishment of supply dumps for fuel, ammunition, and construction materials became a priority since the usefulness of Mindoro as a base depended on how quickly air operations could begin. By evening, the initial objectives of the first day had been largely achieved: a beachhead of limited depth, control of key road junctions near the coast, and the commencement of airfield preparation. Japanese local counterattacks remained small and were constrained by terrain, communications, and the limited size of the garrison. The first engagements on Mindoro thus produced a situation in which one side had secured a foothold and begun to shape the terrain for its operational purposes, while the other prepared to rely increasingly on forces based outside the island to challenge what had become, in effect, a new Allied airhead on the approach to Luzon. In the days following the 15th of December landing, the conflict around Mindoro shifted from a brief ground engagement to a prolonged struggle over sea lanes and airspace. While infantry units expanded the beachhead only gradually, the critical escalation occurred offshore, where every resupply convoy attracted renewed Japanese attention. The experience of earlier attacks on approaching ships led American commanders to tighten sailing formations, increase the density of anti-aircraft guns on individual vessels, and maintain nearly continuous combat air patrols. Despite these measures, the volume and persistence of air attacks turned the waters around Mindoro into one of the most hazardous sectors in the Philippine campaign. On land, U.S. forces moved to deepen the perimeter around San Jose and Mangarin Bay. Elements of the 24th Infantry Division pushed a few kilometers inland to secure road junctions and high ground that could threaten the airfield sites. Artillery batteries and anti-aircraft units arrived with subsequent waves, creating overlapping zones of fire against low-flying aircraft. Engineer regiments operated continuously to drain wet ground, grade runways, and extend dispersal areas. Within less than 2 weeks, a main airstrip of roughly 2,100 meters was operational, capable of handling groups of P-38 and P-47 fighters and B-25 medium bombers. Additional work prepared secondary strips north of the primary field, creating a cluster of air facilities rather than a single target. For Japanese commands on Luzon and in the central Philippines, this rapid buildup sharpened the sense of crisis. The emergence of a functioning Allied air base on Mindoro meant that forthcoming operations against Luzon would benefit from closer fighter escort and more frequent bombing sorties. To contest this development, the 4th Air Army and Naval Air Units directed increasing numbers of aircraft toward shipping routes leading to Mindoro and to the anchorage inside Mangarin Bay. Between 21st and 30th December, repeated raids struck convoys bringing fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and construction materials. In one attack on a resupply convoy, 2 tank landing ships were sunk and a cargo vessel was damaged. In later actions, 3 Liberty ships, a tanker carrying aviation gasoline, 2 additional landing ships, a destroyer, and several landing craft were lost. Hundreds of crew members and embarked personnel were killed or wounded in this sequence of engagements. These losses created tangible logistical strains. Each sunken transport represented not only casualties, but also the destruction or delay of vehicles, engineering equipment, and aviation stores intended for Mindoro, and ultimately for Luzon. Convoy schedules had to be adjusted, with some ships diverted to alternative routes or delayed until air conditions were judged more favorable. The need to maintain the tempo of supply, however, meant that operations could not simply be suspended. Crews on surviving vessels experienced long periods at battle stations, with multiple air raid alarms per day, and repeated contacts with single or small groups of attackers. For many sailors, the Mindoro run became associated with continuous vigilance and intermittent, sudden episodes of high-intensity danger. On Mindoro itself, the escalation manifested as frequent air raid warnings and intermittent bombing, or strafing attacks on the anchorage and airstrip construction areas. Anti-aircraft gunners on shore and afloat engaged attackers at various altitudes, sometimes over friendly installations and beaches. Ground casualties among American and Filipino personnel remained lower than those at major land battles elsewhere, but the cumulative effect of raids included damaged equipment, delayed construction, and the constant need to repair runway surfaces and dispersal bays. For Japanese pilots assigned to special attack missions, Mindoro convoys and anchorages offered high-value targets, but fuel shortages, losses en route, and Allied fighter opposition limited the proportion of aircraft that reached their objectives. Civilian communities on southern Mindoro faced an altered environment as the beachhead expanded. The presence of large supply dumps and airfields brought increased military traffic along local roads and the requisition of labor, building materials, and foodstuffs. At the same time, the proximity of Allied medical facilities and supply depots offered some inhabitants access to paid work or medical assistance unavailable during the earlier occupation. Japanese authority in the interior receded further as surviving units withdrew northward or toward more defensible terrain. But this also meant that some villages lay between opposing forces and were exposed to patrol clashes or air activity overhead. At higher command levels, the escalation around Mindoro fed into assessments of the overall Philippine campaign. In Allied headquarters, reports of shipping losses and airfield progress were weighed against the fixed timetable for the Luzon landings. The sinking of supply ships and warships was acknowledged as significant, yet the expanding capacity of Mindoro-based aircraft to operate against Luzon targets was considered essential to the forthcoming operation and therefore justified continued risk. In Japanese headquarters, situation reports combined successful attacks on individual ships with estimates of the increasing Allied air strength on Mindoro. Public communiques emphasized the damage inflicted on enemy convoys, while internal analyses recorded the steady attrition of aircraft and trained aircrew. By late December, the Mindoro sector had become an example of how limited Japanese resources could still impose costs, but not halt the establishment of a new Allied forward base within striking distance of Luzon. By late December 1944, the campaign around Mindoro reached its most intense phase, defined less by ground maneuver than by the concentration of air power on and around the island. Within 13 days of the landing, engineers had completed 2 operational airfields near San Jose. Runways, dispersal bays, and fuel storage areas were laid out to accommodate fighter and medium bomber units that had begun to arrive from Leyte and more distant bases. These facilities soon hosted formations such as the 310th Bombardment Wing and multiple fighter groups of the 5th Air Force, turning Mindoro into a major forward base rather than a limited beachhead. The tempo of sorties rose rapidly. From Mindoro and Leyte, Allied aircraft flew missions against airfields at Clark, Nichols, and other installations on Luzon, as well as against shipping routes in the South China Sea and along the coasts of the central Philippines. B-25 medium bombers, B-24 heavy bombers, and fighters including P-38s and P-47s operated from the new fields, attacking runways, fuel depots, and transport convoys. For air crews, Mindoro meant short flight times to targets, but also the constant expectation of counterattacks on their own base, since the island lay within range of Japanese air units on Luzon and in neighboring islands. Japanese commanders recognized that Mindoro's airfields had become a critical element of the forthcoming Luzon landings. To limit their impact, they attempted to combine night bombing, daylight raids, and special attack missions against both the airstrips and the convoys that sustained them. In the period from 28 December 1944 to 4 January 1945, Japanese aircraft mounted repeated operations over the island and adjacent waters. According to U.S. Army Air Force's records, Japanese air units lost around 50 aircraft in the Mindoro area during these days, a figure that reflects both the scale of their effort and the strength of Allied fighter defense and anti-aircraft fire. One of the heaviest individual raids occurred during the night of the 2nd to 3rd of January 1945, when Japanese bombers and attackers struck the Mindoro airfields. They managed to destroy 15 P-38 fighters and 7 A-20 attack aircraft on the ground, as well as damaging other installations. For the units concerned, this represented a significant fraction of their available aircraft, requiring rapid replacement and repairs. At the same time, Japanese crews involved in the raid faced concentrated searchlight and anti-aircraft fire, plus interception by night fighters, where available. Losses among the attacking force contributed to the overall attrition that reduced the intensity of later raids. Offshore, the peak of the campaign was marked by complex air-sea engagements in the Mindoro Strait and approaches to the island. On December 26, 1944, Japanese surface forces that included the destroyer Kiyoshimo attempted to approach Allied positions near Mindoro. U.S. Army Air Force's B-25s, P-38s, P-40s, and P-47s, together with Navy patrol bombers, attacked these ships in successive waves west of the island. Contemporary accounts report that Kiyoshimo was sunk and other vessels damaged, while the American formations lost 3 B-25s, 10 P-47s, 6 P-40, and 7 P-38s in the course of the battle. For Japanese sailors, the action illustrated the vulnerability of surface units in confined waters under strong Allied air pressure. For Allied air crews, it showed the high cost of attacking heavily armed ships at low altitude. On the ground, the presence of major air headquarters on Mindoro signaled the island's central role at this stage. By January 1945, the 5th Air Force had shifted its headquarters, along with associated bomber and fighter commands, from the mud of Leyte to the drier environment of Mindoro, bringing staff officers, communications units, and logistics elements closer to the Luzon battle area. This relocation enabled more direct supervision of air operations in support of the Lingayen Gulf landings and subsequent inland advances, but it also concentrated personnel and installations within a relatively compact perimeter exposed to further air attack. For Filipino civilians and guerrilla groups, the peak of the campaign brought both increased risk and new forms of interaction. The steady traffic of transport aircraft, bombers, and fighters created continuous noise, dust, and occasional accidents around the airfields. Japanese raids sometimes dropped bombs that missed military targets and fell near villages or along roads used by local inhabitants. At the same time, the enlarged Allied presence meant greater demand for labor, supplies, and information. Some residents worked as guides, porters, or laborers in airfield construction and maintenance, while others attempted to keep distance from the expanding military zone. By early January 1945, the combined effect of intense Japanese air activity, heavy Allied air and sea operations, and the consolidation of Mindoro's base infrastructure marked a clear culmination of the island's campaign phase. Japanese strike capacity in the sector had been reduced by aircraft and crew losses, yet they had inflicted real damage on shipping and air units. Allied forces, despite these losses, had achieved their principal aim. Mindoro functioned as an active forward air base within range of Luzon, with multiple runways in service and a dense concentration of bomber and fighter units prepared to support the next major step of the Philippines campaign. As the Mindoro base shifted from improvisation to routine operations in January 1945, all participants adapted to a new pattern of continuous but controlled pressure. For Allied commands, the island was no longer just a landing site, but a functioning air and logistics hub that had to withstand repeated raids while preparing for the Luzon offensive. For Japanese planners and air crews, the experience of high losses against heavily defended convoys and airfields forced further reliance on dispersed operations and special attack tactics. Filipino guerrilla organizations and civilians adjusted to the presence of a large Allied garrison and the gradual withdrawal of Japanese authority from southern Mindoro. Allied naval forces refined their methods of protecting the Mindoro supply route. Convoys were reorganized to concentrate heavily armed escorts around vulnerable transports, with radar-equipped ships pushed farther out as early warning elements. Combat air patrols were coordinated between escort carriers and Mindoro-based fighters, creating overlapping coverage along critical segments of the approach. After early losses, convoy commanders adjusted routes and timing, sometimes sailing at night or under cover of bad weather to complicate Japanese interception. These changes did not eliminate risk, but reduced the frequency with which attackers could reach densely packed transport formations. On Mindoro itself, air and ground units modified their procedures to limit the effects of raids that could not be prevented. Aircraft were dispersed into revetments, parked under camouflage nets, or shifted between fields to avoid predictable patterns. Runway repair teams were kept on standby with pre-positioned materials, enabling damaged surfaces to be patched quickly after night attacks. Fuel and ammunition were stored in multiple smaller dumps rather than a few large depots, reducing the chance that a single hit would disrupt operations. The transfer of major commands such as 5th Air Force Headquarters from Leyte to Mindoro also brought additional communications, radar, and engineering resources that improved warning times and base resilience. Adaptation extended to Allied cooperation beyond U.S. forces. Royal Australian Air Force Catalina squadrons, which had mined the entrance to Manila Bay to hinder Japanese naval movements during the Mindoro phase, continued to carry out reconnaissance, mine-laying, and night harassment missions that complemented Mindoro-based strikes. Their operations formed part of a wider pattern, in which long-range patrol aircraft limited the freedom of movement of Japanese shipping, while medium and fighter bombers from Mindoro concentrated on Luzon airfields and coastal routes. This distributed approach sought to keep pressure on multiple segments of the Japanese defense system using assets based on and supported through the Mindoro airhead. Japanese air and naval commands responded to these developments under conditions of shrinking resources. After heavy attrition during the Leyte and early Mindoro stages, remaining aircraft were increasingly assigned to special attack missions intended to bypass the growing strength of Allied defenses by concentrating destructive power in individual pilots. Operational orders emphasized low-level approaches, use of terrain and cloud cover, and attacks on key ships such as tankers, ammunition carriers, and command vessels. To preserve surviving aircraft, some units shifted to satellite fields and improvised strips, reducing vulnerability to preemptive bombing but complicating maintenance and coordination. Filipino guerrilla forces on Mindoro adapted from primarily clandestine resistance to semi-open cooperation with the Allied garrison. With Japanese units pulling back toward the island's interior and northern sectors, guerrilla commanders expanded patrols, collected information on remaining enemy positions, and assisted in securing villages and roads that linked the airfields to inland areas. Their reports on terrain, water sources, and local conditions were incorporated into Allied planning for further patrols and small unit operations, while guerrilla control of wide rural zones reduced the likelihood of organized Japanese counterattacks from the interior. Civilian communities adjusted their daily routines to the presence of large airfields and supply depots. Some inhabitants entered wage labor for construction, transport, or service work connected to the Allied installations, integrating the new base into local economies. Others attempted to maintain subsistence agriculture and fishing while accommodating restrictions on movement near military zones and responding to air raid warnings. The pattern of risk changed. Direct exposure to Japanese ground patrols diminished in many southern areas, but the possibility of being caught near targets during bombing or strafing increased as Mindoro's strategic value rose. The psychological environment also evolved. Among Allied sailors and airmen, the experience of facing kamikaze attacks produced a specific form of alertness. Long periods of uneventful watchkeeping, punctuated by brief, intense engagements, that could cause heavy casualties in minutes. Training and drills were adjusted to emphasize rapid detection and concentrated fire against single attackers, and unit reports show attention to measures that might reduce fatigue and maintain readiness over extended periods. For Japanese pilots and ground crews, the growing emphasis on one-way missions and night raids reshaped expectations of combat, while recurring losses and the visible expansion of Allied bases on islands like Mindoro underscored the difficulty of reversing the broader operational trend. The turning point in the Mindoro campaign came not with a single dramatic clash on the island, but with the moment when Mindoro-based air power began to shape operations beyond it. On January 9, 1945, when U.S. 6th Army assaulted Lingayen Gulf on Luzon, with more than 170,000 troops in the initial waves, fighters and medium bombers from Mindoro flew cover and attack missions against Japanese positions and lines of communication. Their presence reduced the distance between air bases and the main battlefield, allowing more sorties per day and quicker responses to changing conditions ashore. For Allied planners, this confirmed that the decision to seize Mindoro had achieved its operational purpose. In the days immediately surrounding the Lingayen landings, Mindoro's airfields reached some of their highest sortie rates. Fighter groups flew multiple missions daily, escorting bombers, strafing road traffic, and attacking airfields that could launch Japanese aircraft against the Luzon beachheads. Medium bombers struck bridges, depots, and troop concentrations along routes leading toward the landing areas. Japanese air units still attempted to penetrate this expanding air umbrella with raids against shipping in Lingayen Gulf and against the Mindoro base itself, but the accumulation of earlier losses and damage to their own airfields limited the scale of these efforts. The balance of initiative in the air had shifted decisively away from them. This transition affected Japanese ground forces on Luzon and Mindoro in different ways. On Luzon, units tasked with opposing the Lingayen landings faced increasing disruption of their supply movements as Allied aircraft attacked convoys and road columns. On Mindoro, the small garrison found itself increasingly isolated, with the southern part of the island firmly under Allied control and air and sea routes dominated by Allied forces. Opportunities for reinforcement or evacuation declined. Remaining Japanese troops moved into more remote terrain, focusing on survival and local harassment rather than attempts to challenge the airfields directly. For Allied naval forces, the shift in emphasis from securing Mindoro to sustaining operations at Lingayen meant that the Mindoro run, while still hazardous, became one segment of a wider logistics system serving multiple fronts on Luzon. Convoys continued to bring fuel, ammunition, and construction materials to Mangarin Bay, but the heaviest concentration of Japanese air attacks now focused on the larger assemblies of ships off Lingayen. The earlier experience of defending Mindoro bound convoys informed tactics in the Gulf, with similar patterns of tight escort screens, overlapping radar coverage, and close coordination between shipborne and land-based fighters. Among Filipino guerrilla organizations and civilians, the turning point was perceived through changes in military traffic and patterns of authority. Guerrilla reports indicated fewer Japanese patrols in southern Mindoro, and an increase in Allied movements toward embarkation points for operations elsewhere. Local leaders who had maintained communication with the exiled Philippine Commonwealth government began to prepare for a gradual re-establishment of civil structures in areas around the base, even as large parts of the island remained under military administration. For many residents, the period marked a shift from expectation of new battles on Mindoro itself to awareness that the main fighting had moved to Luzon, though air raid warnings and occasional attacks still reminded them of the ongoing wider war. At higher command levels, assessments of the Mindoro operation increasingly treated the island as an accomplished step within the broader Philippine campaign. Reports from Southwest Pacific Area, Headquarters and 5th Air Force emphasized statistics such as the number of sorties launched from Mindoro, tonnage of bombs dropped on Luzon, and damage inflicted on Japanese installations, using these figures to demonstrate the contribution of the Mindoro base to the progress of the Luzon offensive. Japanese staff studies, by contrast, recorded Mindoro as one element in a chain of setbacks that had allowed Allied air power to advance steadily northward, bringing successive landings under closer cover. By late January 1945, the direct threat to Mindoro had diminished. Japanese air raids became less frequent and involved fewer aircraft. Damage still occurred, but repairs were handled as part of established routines rather than emergency measures. The island's airfields continued to launch missions in support of ground operations on Luzon and against targets farther afield, but the sense of Mindoro as a contested forward edge of operations gave way to its role as a secure rear area base. The turning point, therefore, was not a single day of fighting on Mindoro, but the moment when its airfields became integral to an offensive that had moved beyond the island, while Japanese forces no longer possessed the means to reverse or significantly delay that transformation. By early February 1945, organized combat operations on southern Mindoro had largely ceased. U.S. ground forces held the coastal plain around San Jose and the airfields, while Japanese units that had survived the initial fighting and subsequent patrols withdrew into the mountainous interior or attempted to move north toward less accessible areas. Small groups of Japanese soldiers continued to operate as scattered detachments, avoiding direct confrontation and relying on limited local resources. American and Filipino patrols periodically clashed with these remnants, but no large-scale engagements developed on the island after the main perimeter had been secured. The end of major combat did not mean an immediate demobilization of forces. U.S. Army units maintained garrison duties around the airfields, supply depots, and key road junctions, while engineer and service units continued to expand facilities. Air operations from Mindoro supported ground campaigns on Luzon, and, later, strikes extending toward Formosa and the Chinese coast. This required a steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. So, convoys to Mangaran Bay remained an operational necessity even after the intensity of Japanese air attacks declined. Naval and air commands treated Mindoro as a rear area that still required protection against occasional raids and submarine threats. Mopping up operations on the island extended over many months. Allied commanders tasked infantry companies and Filipino guerrilla units with systematic sweeps of interior valleys and ridgelines where small Japanese groups might be hiding. These patrols sometimes resulted in brief firefights, the capture of individuals, or the discovery of abandoned positions and supply caches. In some cases, Japanese soldiers surrendered after contact with intermediaries who conveyed news of the shifting front lines and the broader situation in the Philippines. In other instances, groups chose to remain isolated, either unaware of or unwilling to accept the changing strategic circumstances. Civilian life in southern Mindoro gradually adjusted to the new conditions. With the reduction of Japanese presence and the stabilization of the front, villagers around the airfields and along the main roads encountered fewer ground clashes but continued to live near large military installations. Agricultural activity resumed on land that had not been incorporated into base infrastructure, while fishing communities re-established access to coastal waters, subject to navigation controls and security regulations. Some residents remained displaced by earlier fighting, or by the construction of airfields and depots, and local authorities, together with Allied military administrations, had to manage questions of property, compensation, and resettlement. Casualty figures for the Mindoro campaign reflect its character as a limited but intense operation. On the American side, several hundred personnel were killed or wounded, with a significant proportion of losses occurring at sea due to air attacks on convoys and individual ships. Japanese ground forces on Mindoro suffered heavy attrition relative to their small initial numbers through combat during the landing, subsequent engagements, disease, and shortages of food and medical supplies. Japanese air units operating over the island and surrounding waters lost numerous aircraft and air crew in attacks on convoys, airfields, and surface forces. Filipino guerrilla fighters incurred casualties in both pre-invasion and post-landing actions, while civilians experienced deaths, injuries, and displacement from bombardment, raids, and fighting near settlements. The end of major combat around Mindoro also had humanitarian dimensions. Allied medical facilities treated not only wounded soldiers and airmen, but, in some cases, civilians affected by bombing or ground operations. Relief efforts, often coordinated with the Philippine Commonwealth authorities, aimed to restore basic services such as water supply, limited schooling, and local markets in areas near the base. At the same time, Resource demands of the large garrison and air complex placed pressure on local food stocks, timber, and labor, requiring measures to regulate procurement and mitigate shortages. For Japanese soldiers who remained in hiding on Mindoro, the aftermath meant an extended period of uncertainty. Cut off from regular supply and command structures, they relied on small gardens, foraging, and occasional contact with local inhabitants under conditions of mutual suspicion. Some received news of developments elsewhere in the Philippines through captured documents or clandestine listening to Allied broadcasts. Others had only fragmentary information. When Japan announced its intention to accept the terms of surrender in August 1945, orders eventually reached some of these isolated groups, leading to formal surrenders that continued into late 1945 and, in a few cases, beyond. By the time large-scale operations on Luzon and in other parts of the Philippines had moved the main fighting far to the north, Mindoro's role in active combat had diminished, but the island remained militarized. Airfields, depots, and headquarters installations continued to function as part of the logistics network, supporting later stages of the Pacific War. For the local population, the aftermath of the battle meant living alongside this infrastructure, negotiating the coexistence of civilian recovery, with the presence of foreign troops and the memories of the brief but consequential campaign that had transformed the strategic position of the island. In retrospect, the Battle of Mindoro occupies a particular place in the history of the Philippine campaign, limited in duration and ground casualties compared to larger battles, yet central to the operational design that brought Allied forces to Luzon. Strategically, Mindoro's value lay in concrete factors that can be measured. The construction of multiple airfields within effective fighter and medium bomber range of Lingayen Gulf, the relocation of major air headquarters from Leyte, and the volume of sorties flown from the island in January and February 1945 in direct support of the Luzon landings. The operation showed how a relatively small landing force, backed by substantial naval and air assets, could reshape the geography of an air campaign. For Allied planners, Mindoro confirmed lessons about the integration of logistics, air power, and amphibious warfare. The heavy losses inflicted on convoys by Japanese air attacks, including kamikaze strikes, underlined the vulnerability of shipping, even when shielded by escorts and combat air patrols. At the same time, the rapid construction of serviceable runways on drier ground than Leyte and the high sortie rates achieved from them illustrated the importance of precisely chosen intermediate bases. In post-war analyses, Mindoro often appears as a case study in how an operation with relatively modest troop strength can generate significant effects through changes in basing and supply lines. From the Japanese perspective, the battle highlighted both the potential and the limits of late-war defensive concepts. Special attack missions sank transports, landing ships, and escorts and destroyed aircraft on the ground, imposing measurable losses of ships, materiel, and airframes. Yet these efforts did not prevent the establishment and expansion of the Mindoro airhead. For Japanese staff officers reviewing the campaign, Mindoro formed part of a sequence in which the inability to contest control of the air and sea around intermediate objectives allowed Allied forces to advance their base system toward the home islands, despite tactical successes in individual engagements. For Filipino society, the significance of Mindoro can be traced in several directions. Locally, the landing and subsequent buildup transformed the southern part of the island into a major military zone, with economic, social, and environmental consequences that continued after the fighting moved north. Guerrilla organizations that had operated under occupation gained recognition for their role in providing intelligence and securing areas beyond the initial beachhead. Nationally, Mindoro formed one step in the larger process that led to the liberation of Manila and the gradual restoration of Commonwealth authority. Civilian experiences of displacement, requisition, employment on Allied projects, and contact with foreign troops contributed to diverse memories of the war that were not limited to the most publicized battles. In military historiography, the operation has generated differing emphases. Some studies treat Mindoro as a relatively minor engagement, whose main purpose was to provide airfields for the much larger Luzon campaign, focusing on order of battle data and casualty figures to show its limited scale. Others highlight the intensity of the air-sea struggle around the island, noting the number of ships sunk or damaged, and the role of kamikaze operations in shaping Allied convoy doctrine. A further line of analysis situates Mindoro within debates on airbase selection, engineering capabilities, and the balance between risk to shipping and the advantages of forward air positioning. Commemoration of the Mindoro campaign reflects these varied perspectives. In the Philippines, memorials and local histories recall the landings, guerrilla activity, and civilian losses, often integrated into broader narratives of resistance and liberation. In the United States, the battle is remembered primarily within unit histories of divisions, air groups, and naval squadrons that served there, where the Mindoro Run and night air raids appear as specific episodes in longer combat tours. In Japan, accounts of the period emphasize the experience of aircrew assigned to special attack units and the isolation of small garrisons left on secondary islands as the front line receded. Over time, the Battle of Mindoro has come to be understood less as an isolated clash and more as a functional link in the chain connecting earlier operations in New Guinea and the Central Pacific to later actions on Luzon, Okinawa, and beyond. Its legacy lies in the way it illustrates the mechanics of mid-20th century amphibious and air warfare, the coordination of multiple services and national forces, the dependence of large offensives on modest but well-placed intermediate bases, and the impact of those choices on soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians who experience the campaign from very different vantage points.